Well, howdy there, folks. This is your host, ID Jester. Welcome back, all my Advanced Squad Leader friends out there. We are talking about the Advanced Squad Leader rule set in about 15 minutes. We are continuing fire attacks. We're going to start the monster process again of talking about defensive first fire. This is going to take quite a few episodes because this is one of the most important aspects of Advanced Squad Leader, and some of the rules are, it's not confusing, it's just not easy to understand when you look at the text. In fact, we are only going to cover two different rules in this episode. That's how important they are, and I feel that we need to cover them pretty good before we move on. Again, this is a structured, so when I'm talking about some of the rules, we're going to add other rules later on. So if I'm not talking about all of defensive first fire at this point. We're just going to be talking about first fire. So those of you who are a little more knowledgeable with Advanced Squad Leader, just ignore some of the facts that I'm not using all of the rules with defensive first fire when I'm talking about things. But eventually we will get to that. So defensive first fire, and the most important part of that is defensive first fire is unique, and that it can occur during the enemy movement phase as well as your own defensive fire phase. This is one of the most important lines in the whole rule book when we're talking about attacking and defending. This is very interesting in that you actually can use this first fire during your enemy's turn or during your own prep fire turn. Some of the rules that are associated with first fire is enemy movement that is attacked during the during the enemy's movement phase is called defensive first fire, and can be only used versus moving units. Defender must place a first fire counter above all units and weapons that are fired and exhausted their rate of fire. Be sure to place any support weapons that are still eligible to fire above a first fire counter. These units' weapon may not fire again during the movement phase, and of course, big green here, exceptions, subsequent first fire, final protective fire, and intensive fire. You're going to see this exception a lot when we're talking about defensive fire. Defensive fire first fire attacks affect only the moving unit stack, regardless of other units in the same or intervening hexes the instant of the attack. So you're only attacking the units that are moving. So if those units move into a hex with other units in it, you're only going to be affecting the units that are moving or the stack that are moving together. I'm going to start putting vehicle rules in gray so you can kind of see those rules. We're going to kind of separate the vehicle and gun rules away from infantry. Although a vehicle that enters a new hex is considered a moving target throughout the defensive fire phase, only one vehicle at a time is considered moving. Once a unit begins moving or the movement phase is declared over, previously moved units are no longer subject to defensive first fire attacks. Units can expend movement factors and movement points for movement activities other than physically moving, such as placing smoke, grenades, support weapon recovery, etc., but may not combine two or more activities into one simultaneous movement factor, movement point expenditure. So again, a lot of big words, big talking. What does this mean in English? Well, let's look at it here, folks. This is what it means in English, is that you can see, here we got over here on the left-hand side, these are just counters that I like to have on my game board instead of having to keep going through the menu system to bring down counters. So these are just counters. If we look at a first fire counter, I'm just going to bring it out here to the middle of the board. You will notice the most important thing, if you remember when we talked about our different phases of the game, I mentioned that everything is color-coded so that you would know when to remove these counters based upon the phase disc. You can see here it's the Axis player's movement phase, and you can see the first fire counter is actually pinkish purple, I guess is what color that is, and you can see the pinkish purple is actually the defensive fire phase. So this counter is going to, once it's used, is going to be removed at the defensive fire, at the end of the defensive fire phase. So if you use a unit to fire during your enemy's movement phase, it's going to get a first fire counter. And if it does have a first fire counter on it, it can no longer first fire. There might be another opportunity for it to fire, but again, I'm not going to bring in too many rules because we're trying to focus on just a first fire and the rules associated with that. If you're not marked with a first fire counter, let's just move that out of the way again. During the defensive fire phase, you can then defensive fire. So as long as you have units have line of sight and range to enemy units, you're going to be able to shoot them either during the movement phase or the defensive fire phase. So what's the advantage of shooting them in the movement phase as opposed to the defensive fire phase? Well, there's a couple, but the most important is the other rule we are going to talk about, and this is Section A of the rulebook, subsection 4.6. That is FFMO and FFNAM. These are acronyms that stand for First Fire Move in the Open and First Fire Non-Assault Move. So basically, if your infantry that move during the movement phase without using assault or hazardous movement is subject to a -1 FFNAM die roll to all defensive fire attacks against it. Units, again in gray here, so it has something to do with vehicles. Units loading onto or disembarking from vehicles are always subject to FFNAM, except versus mines. And then the other gray one here, a further -1 first fire die roll modifier applies to units moving in the open. But whenever such movement is combined with other positive TEM or line of sight hindrances such as smoke, AFV, Rex, between the target and firer, you no longer get the -1 FFMO die roll modifier. Again, what does all this mean? Well, let's show you. So basically what this means is you are, as a defensive player, when your opponent's doing his movement phase and he's moving his units around, you can shoot at those units. Or you can wait till the defensive fire phase and then you can shoot him as well. But as a defensive player for the turn, it's your job to try and find the best opportunities to use your units to the best of their capabilities. And with that comes into these two modifiers, the FFMO and the FFNAM, which are two acronyms you will learn because you'll be using them over and over and over again because they're that important. So when we talked about infantry movement quite a few episodes ago, we talked about it using its four movement factors, etc., etc. I'm not sure we even talked about infantry assault move. Infantry assault move allows an enemy unit, or allows your units to move into an adjacent location using assault move. The reason you would want to use assault move, obviously, is because you would... Hang on, I need to cough. Sorry. Apologize for that. You would want to use assault move to prevent your enemies from getting a -1 to their dice roll because of your FF, first fire, non-assault move. They would get a -1 if you're not assault moving. And if you assault move, they no longer get that penalty. So if we look at this unit here, I'm sorry, bonus, not penalty. If we look at this unit in J4, if this German player, it's the German player's movement phase, we can see that here. He's got a couple units that he's already prep fired. Again, if these units are prep fired, they cannot move during the movement phase. They cannot shoot during the advanced fire phase. So these units won't be able to do anything for the rest of the turn until we start talking about routing and advancing in close combat, etc., etc. But these units will no longer get to move or shoot. This unit in J4, if the German player declares an assault move, he can assault move into K5. Well, if the Russian player decides to shoot at it, he can defensive shoot at it. But here's the thing. He's not going to get any of the bonuses of the fire non-assault move and the fire in the open because the German player that moved into this hex is he's in a hex with a building, so he's not in the open, and he assault moves, so you get no bonus. So to defensive fire now at this unit, it's not going to do anything other than leave residual in that hex, which again we'll talk about later. We're not going to bring in that rule. So there's really no advantage for the Russian player to go ahead and attack this unit right now, because he can always wait to the defensive fire phase, and he can then decide to shoot at it then, and he would get the same bonuses and penalties later as he would now. Let's look at this unit down here in H5. Now, H5, the German player decides it's going to move, and when he does not declare an assault move, he just says, okay, I'm going to move these units as a stack, and he moves these units into I6. When he does that, you normally give your opponent a few seconds to think about it before you keep moving on and see if he wants to defend the first fire at him. Well, if we decide to defensive first fire at them, we know he's not assault moving, because he would have already declared that. If he would declare an assault move, he would only be able to move into an adjacent hex. So he would be able to move into that hex, and then he would have to stop. But he didn't declare his assault move, so we know he's going to continue moving. The question for the defensive player is to try to figure out, where is he going, and is this my best opportunity to attack this unit? Well, if we think about it, because of this rule 4.6 again, we are going to get some bonuses, some minuses to our attack, because he's non-assault moving. He's non-assault moving, so we get a -1 to our dice roll. And he's also, if I get rid of the units here, you can see that I6 is an open hex, so he is moved into the open. So I'm going to get a -1 because he non-assault moved, and I'm going to get a -1 to my dice roll because he has moved into the open. If the the Russian player decides, well, I got these units in I6, but they're only half squads, and maybe I don't know. He's 1, 2, 3 spaces away. I got one unit here that, one half squad that only shoots 2 spaces away. Maybe I can wait for him to get into this hex, into J6. The Russian player might think he might be coming down and trying to end up here in K7, so he can do some damage to this unit. So the Russian player decides, oh, you know what, pass, go ahead. And then at that point, the German player decides to go ahead and move these units into K5. Oh, well, what just happened? He's now, if the Russian player decides to, okay, I'm going to defensive first fire, he would get a -1 to his dice roll for the non-assault move, but he no longer gets a -1 because he's in the open, because you can clearly see he's now in a building hex. So he has wasted one of his minuses, one of his bonuses actually, to his attack. So because he was thinking, and this is where a lot of the strategy comes in, yes, the German player could move there, and then maybe eventually move into that hex, and then advance into this hex, and then we can have a big close combat attack, and all that might be happening. But you don't know what the German player might be doing, so he might be moving into this hex. So that is the advantage of shooting in the movement phase, is that you would get those FFNAM for non-assault move and FFMO for moving in the open to your attacks. If you don't do anything defensively and the German player moves all of his units around, and you don't defensive first fire on him, and he gets all of his units in the next, then when we go to the next phase, the defensive fire phase, you can still get your opportunities to defensive fire. So that is an opportunity for you. The problem is, like I was mentioning earlier, not the problem, but you want to use your units to the best of their capabilities, and getting those minuses to your attacks are obviously very, very good. So you have to kind of figure out where the enemy might be heading, what you might want to do when you're trying to decide if you want to wait to attack in the defensive fire phase, or if you want to attack him when he's moving in the open. So again, if we look at this unit, let's say in J1 here, we're going to assume it's back to the movement phase here. I can't move this disc backwards, but I could go forward very quickly, I guess. So we'll assume it's back to the movement phase. So it's the movement phase. The German player decides to activate these units in J1. He moves those into this. He is not declared an assault move. So he's spent 2 movement points to move in that. So if the Russian player decides to defensive first fire on him, he would get a -1 for the non-assault move, and he would not get the -1 for moving in the open because he's in a building hex. The problem is, if he decides to wait, the German player could say, okay, I'm done with that. So if the Russian passes and decides not to defensive fire, the German player could then say, okay, I'm done moving that unit. And then the Russian player would go, oh, wait a minute, no, I want to shoot him. No, it's too late. You have to decide whether or not you're going to defensive fire. So you might be, there's a lot of strategy in trying to bait your opponent into doing some attacks, because once he's marked with the first fire counter, you will be done shooting during the movement phase and the defensive fire phase, except for those exceptions we talked about earlier, which is subsequent first fire, final protective fire, and intensive fire. So once you're marked, only those other results will happen that'll give you another shot. So if the Russian player decides to, I'll go ahead and shoot at you, he's going to get a -1 to his attack because he's not assault moving, but then he's going to be marked with, I did it again, Vassal. Sometimes when I move the counters, it just freaks out and doesn't put the counter on there. I think it might be a little confused with my recording software and everything. So let's assume this guy is now marked with the first fire counter in M5. I'm sorry, M4 there. Let's say the German player says, oh, okay, well, I'm going to continue moving. He moves into J3 and then moves into K4. So he continues his move down here. Now the Russian player is like, oh, no, maybe I should have waited. Or maybe the German player even moves into K3 and then L3. And the Russian player is like, oh, I should have waited till you moved into K3 because then you would have been out in the open. I would get a -1 in my attack. So there's always this constant battle back and forth where you're trying to outwit your opponent, trying to make, if you're the attacking player, what you want him to do is maybe think where you're going, trying to confuse him, like this unit down here. Maybe these units are thinking you're going to come down here to K7, so he's going to wait till you get in range so he can use his full firepower against you, but then you backtrack on him and go up to J5, and now you're in the building. Excuse me. Again, this unit here, and you're doing this with all your units, basically. You might be setting up your opponent to use his first fire attacks at inopportune units or inopportune times so that you can move other units into better position. As a defensive player, you're now trying to out-strategize your opponent, trying to figure out where he's going, and trying to use your units to the best of their abilities and get all those FFMAN, NAM, and FFMO modifiers that you can, so you can get lower and lower results and do more damage or have more results against your opponent. And hopefully he'll fail these attacks. So you're trying to use these to the best of your ability, but if you use some of your attacks and then he moves something else, you can't say, oh wow, I wish I would have kept my units available to continue firing, and now they don't have that ability, and your opponent's then moving units on the map board where you don't want them to move them. So it's this constant struggle. And don't forget, you can always decide not to attack and wait till the defensive fire phase. But of course, at that point, you're not going to get any of the FFNAM or FFMO modifiers anymore, because you're in the defensive fire phase. And so that's kind of a lot of the strategy and what you're thinking about, what your opponent's thinking about, trying to sucker you into bad moves, bad attacks, trying to get you to use your firepower up, and that way he can move his units around. Sometimes you'll see him moving little hash squads around, and this is the great thing about the hash squads, is you move the hash squads around and it makes your opponent use their defensive fire against you, and then you can move all your full squads into better positions because they've now used up their first fire counter. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important exceptions to all of this is subsequent first fire, final, protective fire, and intensive fire. And we're going to look at some of these rules in the next episode because they are going to come in and show you that once you think your opponent is done shooting, aha, he might not just be done as much as you think. So we will look at that coming up in the next episode. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you all for all your support. I want to welcome all of my new subscribers out there. Thanks so much. Hopefully you're enjoying this series. Please leave any thoughts, comments, suggestions, any critiques, any of your information. If you have any questions, whatever, just leave them below in the comments, and I'll get to them and reply back to you. So thanks for watching.